Good evening. Welcome to the China Forum. My name is Carrie Dumbaugh. I'm an analyst in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service here in Washington. Today we're changing our format a little bit. Instead of talking about a particular region or specific issues, we're going to be talking to just one particular person. Ambassador Leonard Unger has a stellar resume in the U.S. Foreign Service. He has served as ambassador to Laos and to Thailand, and ambassador for 4 years to the Republic of China on Taiwan. So, Mr. Ambassador, welcome to the China Forum. I realize I've just shortchanged you an awful lot by introducing only 3 of the things that you have done. Do you want to fill us in a little bit on what you might call your career path?
Well, before I became an ambassador, I'd had some experience already in East Asia, but also earlier in Europe. Subsequent to that, once I retired from the Foreign Service after my post in Taiwan, which came to a very abrupt end on December 31st, 1978, when I was done with that, I came back and I taught for about 6 years up in Boston at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. A little bit of time also at Harvard, some of the courses there. And since then, I've come back home to Washington. This is home where our house is and a lot of associations. And I've done some teaching here at SAIS and at also at American U, and probably will be doing some also at Maryland U, but pretty much retired at this point. Yeah, really retired.
Really? Now you have written one book at least on Laos. Or do you have any more in the works?
No. I've written a lot of reasonably short articles, some longer, some shorter, but no, I don't have a book in prospect, and if I said I did, I don't know what my wife would do.
She had trouble putting up with you during your writing stints?
I'm a rather slow writer, and these things drag on and so on.
For a long time.
But probably I like to travel, and we have been off, I think it's about 4 times now, on one of these Southeast Asian cruises where I've been a lecturer. I've gone out for board meetings of some of the institutions like the Asian Institute of Technology in Bangkok. So I managed to get out into my old haunts about 2 or 3 times a year and have a chance to renew associations with old friends and some of the people that I've worked with over the years.
Now you've really concentrated on Southeast Asia, but at least from where I sit and on the China Forum, what is interesting for our purposes is your ambassadorship to the Republic of China on Taiwan. The 1970s saw an enormous number of changes in our relationship with China and Taiwan. We had the secret diplomacy of Henry Kissinger, we had Nixon in China. We broke off relations with Taiwan ultimately and normalized relations with the PRC. And the 4 years that you served as ambassador from what you said, 74 to 78, seemed to me to be the most critical years of that period. And you were right on the spot. Share with us some of your reflections of what happened back then.
Well, that was critical in the sense that it was the period that led up to the very fundamental switch that we made in our relationship. We had for many, many years from when China broke off into 2 separate governments, one on Taiwan and one on the mainland in Beijing, the United States had its relations with Taiwan, and those relations continued through many, many years, and when I went out as ambassador to Taipei, it was to the Republic of China on Taiwan. When I left, precipitously, that was when we changed our relations. I ceased to be ambassador on December 31st, 1978 at midnight, took down the flag, probably more or less simultaneously somebody in Beijing raised the flag, and our representation went on, or was begun, regular formal representation in Beijing.
At midnight you did that. I mean, very formal and...
Yeah, that was it. However, when I say that, that may give some misleading impressions, because it sounds as if up to that moment we had nothing to do with Beijing. After that moment we had nothing to do with Taiwan, but that isn't so. We had we had a number of representatives in Beijing, Winston Lord and another person who's become rather better known and reasonably famous recently, namely George Bush, who was also in Beijing. Leonard Woodcock, who had been with the Auto Workers Union. I think he'd been chairman of that. And similarly, after this took place, and even though our formal representation was in Beijing, we nevertheless have continued to have a much more informal representation in Taipei, but we continue to be in close touch with the government there, so that it wasn't as radical as it may sound, but it corresponded with, you might say, the formalities of the situation.
Well, our office there now is the American Institute in Taiwan.
That's right.
It serves as the de facto office or representative of the U.S. government in Taiwan.
Right.
But while you were there, it was still the embassy.
Oh, it was an embassy.
You were the ambassador.
That's right.
What are some, did you see, everyone saw normalization coming at some point, but when you were serving as ambassador, did you know when it was going to happen, or could you follow the process by which it was happening?
Well, I knew it was coming, but I definitely didn't know precisely when. And I didn't learn about it until, I think it was something like December, perhaps 16th. I'm not sure of my dates, but I think it was something like that. I got word from Washington that the president, Jimmy Carter, would be making a formal announcement the next morning, I think at 9 o'clock Washington time. And I was to go and let Jiang Zemin, the son of Chiang Kai-shek, who was president, I was to let him know at about, I think, 7 o'clock in the morning. And I'm probably not supposed to use profanity over the TV, but in effect I said, to hell with that. Not because of personal considerations, but because it seemed to me stupid not to give the people on Taiwan as much time as possible to face what was obviously going to be an extremely difficult adjustment. And it was in our interest, just as well as theirs, to give them not 2 hours, but as many as I could give them. So as soon as I got this word, the preceding night at about 11 o'clock, I asked the private secretary, James Sung, to let me come and talk to Jiang Zemin, and about 2:30 in the morning, I was able to go, and we had about a 2-hour conversation talking about the kinds of adjustments that they would have to make and whatever we could do under the circumstances to be helpful and ease the adjustment and so on. Because the United States obviously was going to continue to have many important relations with Taiwan, even though our formal representation was shifted. So I talked to him, and we worked out a kind of a scenario, and so when we got word of President Carter's announcement, which hit us at, I think, about 9 o'clock in the morning out there, they were ready to adjust to this. They were ready to put into motion a lot of things that would ease the adjustment from their point of view.
Is it difficult for the American ambassador to get a meeting with the president of a country at 2:30 in the morning? Or?
Well, it depends what he has to say. It's in the first place, it's got to be his judgment as to whether it's that important to wake somebody up in the middle of the night. And I certainly would hesitate long and carefully before I do it. But in this case, I knew that they in Taiwan would want to make as effective an announcement as possible. They would want to alert all of their key personnel. They would want to be sure that they had the situation under control, that they had mapped out how they were going to respond to this. And 2 hours just wasn't enough to do it. You know, they'd barely be able to tell all the important people what was coming.
Right.
So I felt that I just had to do it.
Did Jiang Zemin know what was coming? I mean, when you request a meeting that seems that urgent, surely he knows that there's really one important issue that would cause you to do that. So he would...
I'm sure that he guessed, he may have had several guesses, but I'm sure that was one.
Yeah.
There were, as far back as the preceding, I think it was May perhaps.
This is May of 78.
May of 78, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Several people in the U.S. government had said some things that sounded to begin to be a little bit symptomatic. I think Brzezinski had said something that was kind of a hint. Mm-hmm. Then, late in the summer, I began to hear things, and I was back in Washington in September, and at that point, I knew from many things that were said, I knew that this was coming. I didn't know a precise date, but I knew that it was something that we had to be prepared for. So we began to make our plans, as people also did in Washington in the State Department, as to how we would move from the more or less usual formal embassy to some kind of a new relationship, and what that should be, and what could we devise that would be effective and acceptable to the people on Taiwan, and so on and so forth.
So you were discussing plans like this in Washington on a theoretical basis, not with any complete time frame in mind. But
that's right. And anybody who'd been asked would have denied that anything like that was in prospect.
Of course.
But we were pretty sure it was.
What were some of the... Now, I know that the American Institute in Taiwan, part of that was discussed in the legislation, the Taiwan Relations Act, that went through Congress. Mm-hmm. Was this also a feature of what you were discussing in Washington, some kind of a representative group to handle routine business or economic business?
Yes, we were discussing that, and incidentally, I'd say I take exception to routine.
Right.
Because obviously, while the largest part of business, no doubt, is usually routine, every once in a while, that representation in Beijing, in Taipei, has to pick up some quite delicate and important matters.
Absolutely.
But yeah, we were discussing that because we knew that something like this was coming. Even though we didn't know when, we didn't know just how it would be done, we didn't know what the new relationship would be on both sides, except we knew it would be an embassy in Beijing and something in Taipei. Mm-hmm. But we were trying to identify all the kinds of things that had to be arranged for so that once that took place, we could move into a new kind of relationship and not leave all kinds of things just hanging fire. Mm-hmm. Because, in relationships between countries, things don't wait. Mm-hmm. You have to be able to move right on into a new kind of relationship, and that's what we wanted to forecast.
Well, if you found this out then on December 16th, and you took the flag down at midnight on December 31st, mm-hmm. what were those 16 or 15 days like?
Well, they were very busy. And fortunately, for us out there, and I think for the whole process, the department in Washington sent out the person who was at that time Undersecretary, Warren Christopher, mm-hmm. who is just an absolutely top-notch, first-class individual who came out armed with as much information as was available, and who came out understanding what this meant to the people in Taiwan, the government in mm-hmm. Taiwan, with a very understanding and sympathetic point of view, and determined to work out, with the help of the top echelons in the Chinese government in Taiwan, and my help and the embassy's help, to work out as effective and workable a new arrangement as could be managed. Mm-hmm. And we sat down, and I think he was out there maybe 3 days, maybe 4, and his arrival wasn't entirely happy, and I'll tell you about that. But once he got in and we began to sit down and talk over the problems, we had several days of very, very effective meetings. He, of course, had already talked to people in Washington to get an idea of how much flexibility there was back there, what he could work with in the way of new arrangements. Mm-hmm. So by the time he left, we had pretty well worked out a new arrangement to go into effect essentially on 1st of January, in other words, about 2 weeks later. Mm-hmm. The thing I'm referring to is the fact that when he arrived, we hopped into an embassy limousine, and we started out of the airport area, and we were motioned into a sort of a narrow roadway that would take us out into the city, and then we'd go on about our business. But as we started down that roadway, there was a TV truck right in front of us, and the TV camera was mounted on the roof, and the TV photographer, of course, was very busy taking pictures, and he wanted to get a lot of good pictures, so he told the truck to stop. Meanwhile, we found that on both sides of us were, essentially there was a demonstration. In other words, there were a lot of young folks with placards and so on, standing there yelling slogans and, you know...
Anti-American slogans?
Well, anti the action that it was being taken, yeah. In that sense, anti-American, very critical of the fact that we were shifting our relations, our formal relations, to the mainland. And they had, there we were, this TV truck just stopped dead, so we couldn't move. There were a whole line of cars behind us. This was just a very narrow little lane, and all of these kids were on both sides of us, and they didn't know what to do. They had chanted their chants, and they had yelled their slogans. They had these great big placards mounted on sticks, so they began to knock on the windows, and finally they broke the windows. And I would say that we were beginning to wonder what was going to happen next when the TV truck finally began to move, and Warren Christopher and I left, and I took some back streets and got up to a place that we had up in the hills, and I didn't think very much of it, but my wife was up there, and when she greeted us, she gasped. We were just streaming blood. We didn't, these were all very, very superficial wounds, but there were plenty of them. And of course, we very quickly ascertained that it was nothing serious, but I guess we looked pretty bad.
Tough. Did you see this incident on television then? Was that shown on television?
Some, yeah. Certainly the period when we were there, blocked and unable to move, and the students were demonstrating and so on.
So he didn't have a happy entry into the country there.
Not
but
quite.
The 3 or 4 days of working turned out well, and you came to some conclusions.
Yeah, he's a broad-minded individual, and he was not, I guess, basically he wasn't surprised that there was some kind of demonstration. Neither was I. And the next day we sat down with our Chinese counterparts and began to work out the things that had to be done.
Can I go back for a minute to that midnight to 2:30 meeting with Jiang Zemin? 2 hours, I think you said. Do you recall some of the things that you discussed? I imagine there were other people present and not necessarily...
Not many. Initially, it was just James Sung, his private secretary, whom I had reached to set up the appointment. Just the three of us for quite a while. Incidentally, 2:30 in the morning is when it began. And I certainly never got any more sleep that night, and I'm sure he didn't either, because immediately, you know, we could figure all of the things that had to be done and had to be done in a real hurry. So we talked for, I would guess, about 2 hours. Obviously, he wanted to know as specifically as I could tell him what the new United States relationship was going to be with the Republic of China on Taiwan. You know,
did you have a lot of specifics to give him at that point?
Not as much as I would like to have had, but some. In other words, I could tell him that there was going to be a representation, even though the representative would not be an ambassador, because the formal diplomatic relations were coming to an end. I could tell him exactly when all of this was going to happen. I could give him a little bit of an idea of the things that were going to be said. We both immediately wanted to discuss all the various aspects of our relationship and how things might have to be changed. And you know, we kind of started working on a checklist of things. I could tell him that Christopher was there and was there to help work out in as much time as it took a new kind of a relationship, and that he would be, you know, totally sympathetic to any ideas that the people in Taipei wanted to put forward, and so on. So we had a good talk, but let's face it, it was a real blow.
Right. Hard to be the bearer of bad news like that, as you as the ambassador. You must have spent many hours over those 4 years talking with President Jiang, or CCK, as some people call him.
Yeah.
What were your impressions of him?
By and large, uniformly favorable. I found him a very, very bright, very well informed, very decent. Certainly, I could never complain about my treatment or his willingness to discuss matters with me. Obviously, there were some things that I had to tell him or that he had to tell me that weren't necessarily very pleasant or happy, but we managed to keep a very, very even and I would say a pleasant kind of a relationship. He was certainly available any time that I felt I needed to see him. And I never found him, unwilling to talk about anything.
Do you remember also meeting who is now the president, Lee Teng-hui, during some of those meetings?
Oh, I knew Lee Teng-hui because he was in at least 2 jobs. He was the mayor of Taipei for a while, and of course I lived in Taipei, and there were all kinds of functions going on and so on, so I knew him there. And then there was another job, and I haven't been able to pin this one down, but I think he moved into some kind of a ministerial job, and I knew him.
So you've known him?
But we knew him another way, my wife and I, because he and his wife were both very fond of music. And over and over again, when there was a concert, we'd find ourselves sitting in more or less in the front row right next to him. So
I think many people, going back to President Jiang, many people believe that only President Jiang could have put into effect, after this relations were ended with the United States, formal relations, only President Jiang could have begun to put into effect some of the changes and reforms that have been taking place in Taiwan now. Is that your impression?
I think that's fair enough, because he had, in the first place, the prestige of being his father's son, and therefore, in a sense, there was that continuity with the old days, the Kuomintang and the mainland and all the rest. Moreover, he had proved in the years that he had been premier and president a very, very great capacity to provide real leadership. He didn't look like a leader, didn't really talk much like a leader, but he knew what he wanted to get accomplished, he knew how to do it, and he knew how to do it in a reasonable and a thoughtful way. So I think by the time this happened, he had acquired a sufficient reputation, not just because he was his father's son, but on his own, so that people were prepared to respect him and to go along with what he said. And of course, what he was trying to do was to save as much position and prestige for the Republic of China as he could, but at the same time, you might say, roll with the punch. He knew that there was nothing he could do to reverse this action, and so make the best of it.
So his successor, President Lee Teng-hui, has now recently announced one country, 2 governments. This is an incredible departure from past policy. What is your view of that? Is he going to be able to get the kind of support needed to within the Republic of China on Taiwan to push this forward?
Well, that's a good and an unfathomable question.
But you're a diplomat, and you're supposed to answer these kinds of unfathomable questions.
You know, this is a question that's been alive for a long, long time. How could the 2 pieces of China come back together again? And before things fell apart in Beijing, at Tiananmen Square, I think a number of us felt that there were reasonable people in charge in both places, and that contact was thinkable, even though in earlier times it had not been. And if they could have contact and if they could begin to talk with each other, they could begin to develop the possibility of some kind of an association. I wouldn't hazard a guess as to when and how this can happen, but I think that, and I hope very much that they are going to work this out, and I'm pleased that the people on Taiwan have an open mind on it. Needless to say, they're the ones who probably feel they have most at risk. They're small. They have a thriving economy. They're in wonderful shape economically speaking, but after all, 13,000 square miles and whatever the population is now, it's just nothing as compared to mainland China. They have very few formal international relations. Almost all countries have their relations in Beijing with the mainland, and so they're in a somewhat vulnerable position. But I think that unless there's a sharp change, I think that they're going to be prepared to look at propositions. But they're going to want, at least as long as there's that much difference in policy and outlook and political persuasion between the mainland and Taipei, they're going to want to go slow, and they're not going to want to give up what they consider the essentials of their kind of government and society. The mainland, of course, is so much larger and has so much more weight in anything like that that they need not be that much concerned.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to thank you for being with us today. It was thrilling to hear some of your experiences. I will always carry the image of you out at midnight at the flagpole bringing the flag down. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank our audience for being with us. Stay tuned for us next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.